Hi, my name's James Mawson, founder and editor-in-chief of Global Corporate Venturing, and it's a great pleasure to be joined by Lord Adair Turner, who's the chair of the Energy Transitions Commission. Welcome.
Nice to be here.
Yeah, thanks very much for joining. I'm really excited by this session, which is looking at hydrogen, the next big thing. But before we dive into some of the questions, I was just going to give a little bit of the background, because obviously you've got a fantastic and storied career there. And, I just wanted to pick out a couple of the points that you've done, obviously, as in charge of the sort of the UK financial regulator, what was then known as the Financial Services Authority. But all before that, obviously, a storied career within finance and working in the city, and more recently tackling some of the more important issues within society, such as the Low Pay Commission, and in particular looking at climate change, which is what we're going to focus on today. So delighted to have someone with your background and experience. So thanks for being able to join us. I suppose my sort of thinking when we're starting about hydrogen is almost to take a step back to say, how important really is it? When you were first in charge and chair of the Climate Change Committee a dozen or so years ago, it felt like there was still talk about climate change itself being, is it important, how much of an issue? Now, you're chair of the Energy Transitions Commission, which seems to imply that it is. What's the most recent reports that you've been looking at, seem to be saying in terms of how important this topic is?
I think what's clear, and it's only really become clear over the last 10 years, is that we know the key elements of how you build a zero carbon economy. And I do think we do need to build a zero carbon economy across the world, and we need it in place by 2050. And we now know that the absolute core of building a zero carbon economy is to electrify as much of the economy as possible, and to make sure that all of that electricity comes from zero carbon sources. And we can do that. We can electrify the whole of passenger road transport, and we will do that with battery electric vehicles. We will probably electrify most of residential heat. And across the world, there will also be growing demands for electricity, for instance, from air conditioning and just gradual increase in prosperity. Put all that together, and the total direct use of electricity could go from today's 27,000 terawatt hours to as much as 70 or 90,000 terawatt hours by 2050. But you then get some sectors of the economy that you can't just say, I'm going to electrify it with, for instance, a battery. We can't make long distance aviation work on battery-based electricity, or long distance shipping. You can't at the moment simply electrify the process of making steel or various petrochemicals. And what it turns out is that the most important technology to deal with the bits of the economy which you cannot electrify is hydrogen. And so increasingly at the Energy Transition Commission, we think of it like this. At the moment, when you look at final energy demand, about 20% is being used in the form of electricity. That percentage could go up to 60% by 2050. We could be getting 60% of our energy in electrical form and using it as electricity. But beyond that, there's another 10, 15% or so of our final energy we will use in the form of hydrogen, and we will primarily make that hydrogen from green electricity through the process of electrolysis. So this slice of the hydrogen economy on top of direct electrification really is the absolute core of how we get to a zero carbon economy.
That's fascinating, and it's great to hear those sort of numbers said there. I suppose if I think about what we're currently going through now, this is obviously in early sort of November time, that this will be shown. But effectively, there's a lot of concern that will we make that transition in a feasible way, in a cost-effective way? So if we think about hydrogen and electrification, and to make both of them green enough, that net zero element, can we do so in a way that's actually achievable and in people's pockets way?
Well, the thing that has been transformed over the last 10 years is the cost of both producing green electricity and using it. The cost of producing it from solar PV has come down about 80 or 90%. And when I think about the estimates that we made at the UK Climate Change Committee as to what was going to happen to the cost of solar PV, well, I just feel embarrassed because we failed to see how fast this cost would come down. The cost of wind has come down 60%. The cost of offshore wind has come down. The cost of batteries have collapsed. And that's what enables us to be absolutely certain that the way forward with passenger cars is the battery electric vehicle. What is now happening is that the cost of producing green hydrogen is also collapsing. There are only two things that matter to the cost of producing green hydrogen. One is the cost of the electricity that you put in. And as I've said, that's falling because of the falling cost of renewables. And the other is the cost of the electrolyzers. And what is now happening is dramatic reductions in the cost of electrolyzers, being driven above all by various manufacturers in China, but also European manufacturers are also driving down the cost. In essence, the way to think about electrolyzers in the past was that it was a cottage industry. Of today's 100 million tons of hydrogen produced in the world, only 2 or 3% of that was being produced by electrolysis. So there was a minute demand for electrolyzers. So they were being manufactured in an old cottage industry, bespoke to order fashion. In the future, we could have 500 to 700 million tons of hydrogen being used each year. 85 or 90% of that might be coming from green hydrogen. And that means that the demand for electrolyzers is not just going to go up 10 times, it's going to go up 100 times. And once you do that, the costs come thumping down. So the fact is that the cost of producing green hydrogen, today it might cost you $4 or $5 per kilogram. There are lots of absolutely credible people in Australia, in India, in Europe, saying they will get that cost down to below $2 a kilogram, below $1.5 a kilogram, or if you go to India, Mukesh Ambani is saying he'll get it down to $1 a kilogram within the 2020s. Now, it may not get all the way there, but it is going to come into the range where it becomes much more economic to apply green hydrogen in particular in a range of different applications.
That's fascinating. Obviously, we've seen a lot of money flowing into this area, I think partly on reports that you've been bringing out at the Energy Transitions Commission. But last month in October, we saw ITM Power raise 250 million in a share sale. You know, we've seen sort of Total Energies in France looking to raise 2 billion euros for a venture fund, a corporate venture fund focused on hydrogen. We've seen a lot of deals, a lot of activity. So where do you see some of the pain points? How do you see the entrepreneurs contributing? Or is this, like with PV and like with wind, actually a scale-up opportunity? And it's more about bringing enough capital to develop technologies already. Is there still room for the entrepreneurs?
I think there is room for the entrepreneurs, but the big pinch point, the big challenge is what we call the chicken and egg of supply and demand. So the cost of electrolyzers will come down if the quantity of electrolyzers being produced across the world comes down. We will have the classic learning curve and economies of scale effects that we've seen in solar PV and batteries. And what you have around the world now is countries or jurisdictions like the EU committing to have certain volumes of electrolyzer manufacture equipment by 2030. For instance, the EU has said 40 gigawatts of capacity by 2030 and another 40 gigawatts, around Europe elsewhere. Once you start getting those commitments, the believable part of this story is that the cost of producing green hydrogen is going to come down. So I'm pretty confident that we are going to see big reductions in the cost of electrolyzer capital equipment, big reductions in the cost of delivered green hydrogen. Where I think we now need to switch attention is actually to the demand side, because the interesting point is that even when you do get, for instance, green hydrogen at $1.50 a kilogram, if you put that into steel production, that steel will still be more expensive than producing steel from the old blast furnace coking coal route. And so there's an issue of how are we going to bridge that green premium, not in the hydrogen itself, but on the product side. And I think attention now needs to switch to how does public policy and procurement actions by companies, for instance, automotive companies committing to buying green steel, how does it create the demand for the products which increasingly we know how to produce at a cheaper level, but not as cheap as the old low carbon technologies? Again, take shipping. I think it's increasingly clear that the zero carbon future of shipping is either methanol or, my guess is in the long run, ammonia, both of which have a hydrogen input. But that will be more expensive than using heavy fuel oil. So somebody's got to pay for that. You've either got to have a global carbon tax, or you've got to get regulations that make it economic for the shipping companies that want to say, I'm now going to start placing my big orders for ammonia supply, to do that, even though it's more expensive. So very important to get the development of both supply and demand occurring in balance. Right at the moment, I would say the supply side, the electrolyzer factories, the reduction in the production cost is going as fast or even faster than we could have dreamed. Bit of focus now needed on how do we pump prime the early demand for the output, which I think is going to be coming forward.
You mentioned obviously the sort of carbon pricing. Can you say a little bit more, given obviously your background within financial markets, how important that could be? Because it seems to be that there's a reluctance to put anywhere near what should be a proper carbon tax or carbon price on the market. So is that fundamentally going to hold back demand, or do you think that it can be dealt with?
Well, look, it depends sector by sector. Let's take shipping. The good news about shipping is that it does have an international regulator with rule-making power, the International Maritime Organization. And the International Maritime Organization, does place clear regulations on what types of fuel you can use. Primarily in the past, it's done that for both health and safety reasons and local pollution levels, getting rid of water-based pollution. But it has the ability to say, we are going to have a regulation that pushes you towards zero carbon fuels. Or it could be a vehicle which imposes a carbon tax on an equal basis across the world. So in both shipping and aviation, where we have ICAO, we do actually have international rule-making bodies which could push it forward on a coordinated basis. In other sectors of the economy, that's not going to be possible. And we have to progress somewhat unilaterally, but also using what are called border carbon adjustments. So let's take steel and the European carbon price. European carbon price within the emissions trading scheme is now getting to serious levels, $60 or $65 a ton. In a report we just put out last week from the Net Zero Steel Initiative, we said that if you could have across the world a carbon price of $70 a ton, you would really begin to drive decarbonization of the steel industry at quite a rapid pace, 37% reductions in emissions by 2030. Initially, that would be partly with hydrogen. It would also be by the use of methane and then a switch out to hydrogen at a later stage. The challenge, of course, is you could get that price in Europe, but if it's not there in the rest of the world, then European steel developers like SSAB in Sweden or ArcelorMittal in Spain, both of whom have committed to make steel from the hydrogen direct reduction basis, if they go ahead in Europe, encouraged by a carbon price, but it doesn't apply in Turkey or Russia or China or India, they're a competitive disadvantage. And that's where the whole debate about border carbon adjustments come in. But the answer is carbon pricing is one of the tools. I don't think it's the only tool. You can also use green procurement from governments to say that they're willing to buy green steel or require green steel in public buildings, etc. There are regulatory routes, there's direct subsidy routes, but certainly carbon pricing is always a very powerful tool. And the faster that we can get to widespread carbon prices, not just in Europe, but across the rest of the world, the better.
Wonderful. And we're obviously sitting here in the UK part of Europe. And so how important do you see Europe within that hydrogen market? Because you mentioned obviously India and China, Australia, other places, will ultimately the hydrogen and the electrolyzers be more dependent on the sources of that clean energy, and then the technology becomes fundamentally fungible? Or do you see it actually that there's a competitive advantage being able to develop this sort of technology? How do you see the sort of market dynamics breaking down here? Because batteries have clearly gone to China, even though many of them were developed very early in Germany and other places. What do you see happening within hydrogen?
Well, let's be clear, batteries have gone to China in some ways, but of course some of those companies are themselves building factories in the UK. I happen to be on the board of a battery company, a Japanese-based battery company owned by a Chinese owner, and we have the biggest battery. It's called Envision, and we have the biggest battery company in the UK at Sunderland. So even if a technology starts in one area, the value chain can also develop elsewhere, and that's a natural process. I think on electrolyzers, lots of people are trying to say, let's make sure that the electrolyzer capacity development is spread across the world. Andrew Forrest, Fortescue Minerals, is building an electrolyzer plant in Queensland. Mukesh Ambani, committed to getting to $1 a kilogram in India, is going to build electrolyzer value chain supply there. Nel from Norway are a major company in electrolyzers in Europe. So although some of the early developments on the cost reductions, I think the Chinese are probably hitting the lowest cost, and we've seen some costs as low as about $230 per kilowatt compared with 800 or 900 used to be typical. I think you will see the electrolyzer capacity being developed across the world, and you'll see a variety of technologies, the alkaline, the PEM, etc., developing. As for where the hydrogen gets produced, that will be everywhere. I think there may be some international trade in hydrogen from places where it's very, very cheap to produce, such as Australia, up to places where it might be more expensive to produce, such as Japan. But I think most places will have local hydrogen production. So if you look at SSAB, who are building a green steel plant in northern Sweden, they are tapping into relatively low cost power sources from Scandinavian hydro and wind resources. The electrolyzers will be based there, the hydrogen will be stored there, and it will go straight into the steel plant there. If you look at what ArcelorMittal are doing in their Bilbao plant in northern Spain, that is in a relationship with Iberdrola. It's developing sun power in Spain to make the hydrogen there. So there may be some international trade in hydrogen, but I think in most parts of the world, we are going to see the hydrogen being made domestically and often right next to the plant, the steel plant or the chemical plant in which it's used, or
Perfect.
Right next to the ammonia plant, which
Wonderful.
is then as close as possible to the port to put into the ships.
Excellent word there. That's fantastic. So very briefly, one word, are you confident we can hit net zero by 2050?
Yes, I'm far more worried about whether we can reduce by 30 or 40% by 2030. But I think by 2050, we'll get pretty close to net zero because the technologies will take us there.
Perfect. You've given us hope. Thank you, Adair. Thank you for your insights.
Thank you very much.